Okay, so a little backstory. Even though you would think that today communism is viewed as this big, horrible, scary thing by people on the right, there was a time period in this country that was called the Red Scare, and it was during the 1950s when the US was engaged in a Cold War with Russia. And people like Joseph McCarthy, who you may have heard of, were hell-bent on rooting out communism and communists from America. So that's why it was called the Red Scare, because it was a time period where people were communists or communist sympathizers were being hunted down by McCarthy and by the government, and by being turned in by their own neighbors. So what happened was this was a time period that affected the entire country, but in particular Hollywood. McCarthy and the government were hell-bent on figuring out who all of the communists were in Hollywood, because they were convinced that Hollywood was harboring many, many communists who were then, who were powerful entertainment figures, who were affecting the films that were being made, which were pro-communist films. So there was a period in the 50s called the Hollywood Blacklist. And now you might hear the Blacklist and go, "Oh, isn't it that show?" Or you might hear the Blacklist and go, "Wait, isn't that website that all the best unproduced scripts of the year end up on?" Yes and yes. But it was also a time period in the 50s where people in the entertainment industry who were found to be communist or communist sympathizers were denied employment in Hollywood. So anyone from actors to studio executives to screenwriters to directors, they were barred from working by the studios if essentially they were found guilty by one of, in one of the many hearings that occurred during this time period to root out communists. Today, who we are talking about specifically is a man called Elia Kazan. And like I said, you might not know who that is, but he is considered one of the most influential and important filmmakers of all time. His granddaughter is Zoe Kazan, who is an actress, and she was in films like The Big Sick. She is her partner is Paul Dano. And Elia Kazan is known for directing on Broadway and also directing films. So he did A Streetcar Named Desire and Death of a Salesman on Broadway, and then film-wise, probably most famous for Streetcar Named Desire, East of Eden, and then a film called On the Waterfront, which he made after he ratted out, I believe, 12 of his former colleagues from this theater group in New York. He ratted them out as communists. So after he became an informer, ratted these people out, he made a film called On the Waterfront, which essentially like glamorizes and puts a positive spin on being an informant. and ratting out bad guys. Because Elia Kazan, once upon a time, was a communist. And then he got to a point where he not only denounced communism, but he believed that harboring secrets, so aka keeping the identities of known communists, was a bad thing. So it wasn't just that he was being threatened by major studios like Fox. It's that he believed, supposedly he believed, that it was his duty to rat out his former comrades. So we're gonna, this first film is the Hollywood Blacklist, just an explainer of it.
The rise of the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Hollywood Blacklist is arguably the most infamous period of American cinema, apart from that decade where we just kept letting Michael Bay make Transformers movies. Hundreds of top professionals saw their careers stalled and stagnated, and in some cases permanently cut short, as Congress pushed an alarmist investigation into individuals working in the film industry.
Something like 300 or so entertainment professionals had their careers ruined because of the Blacklist,
who had suspected ties to communism.
Question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Fueled by intense Cold War rhetoric and paranoia, the Blacklist lasted nearly 2 decades, with its effects lasting long after the hearings ended. The rise of the Blacklist and the House Un-American Activities Committee began in the 1930s, during Hollywood's golden age. Even though some of the most revered classics were produced during this time, America itself was suffering through the grim reality of the Great Depression. Millions of people were out of work and homeless, with little to look forward to or hope for outside of a few brief hours of respite provided by a trip to the movies. As a result, communist and socialist ideals were gaining popularity during this period, because capitalism was being viewed by some as having profoundly failed the American people.
Isn't it funny
With the rise of fascism and
isn't it funny how things come full circle?
post-World War I Europe, some on the Hollywood left came into the orbit of the Communist Party. They wanted to fight fascism, and they liked some of the things communism offered, whether or not any of those things were actually being done in practice. Of course, once World War II broke out, these anti-fascist messages became the majority opinion. Everyone wanted to fight fascism, and join together with the other free nations of the world to stop the Nazis, including Hollywood. Just about every able-bodied man in Hollywood enlisted, like Jimmy Stewart, who would ultimately retire at the rank of Brigadier General. Even renowned screenwriter Dalton Trumbo went to the South Pacific as a war correspondent. Additionally, hundreds of patriotic, pro-war, anti-fascist American films were produced during World War II. There was also a surge in Communist Party membership, in part because popular opinion seemed to be embracing many of the ideals that had excited party members during the Great Depression. It seemed like things were moving towards world peace via a collectivist approach, and towards more socially conscious safety net programs to uplift everyone. But after the alliance with the Soviet Union collapsed following the end of World War II, communists became the next boogeyman. They were vilified by politicians and the media just as badly as fascists and the Nazis had been. And to be fair, a healthy fear of Stalinist Russia wasn't exactly unjustified. But the anti-communist response in the United States has been retroactively described as hysteria, and it's hard to argue with that characterization. Meanwhile, Hollywood films were tackling subjects like racism and anti-Semitism in the wake of the war. You know, all the things America had just been fighting against overseas. And conservative Americans didn't like this, particularly conservative lawmakers and politicians. They thought this kind of filmmaking was going to take over and influence public opinion, and that was a problem for them. And so, Congress formed the House Un-American Activities Committee to investigate Hollywood and root out the communist influencers sneaking their left-wing messages into movies to fuel anti-American sentiment and help the communists take over. HUAC began questioning filmmakers, writers, actors, and other industry professionals about their political beliefs and those of their peers. The goal was to pressure people brought before the committee into giving up their friends in the industry. Those who refused to cooperate were blacklisted, losing their jobs and being blocked from finding further work in Hollywood. If you'd ever been a communist or had communist friends or even just supported liberal or left-wing causes, you could lose your entire career and reputation. Over the next 2 decades, 250 top professionals were blacklisted, including Arthur Miller, Ossie Davis, Ruby Dee, Burgess Meredith, Leonard Bernstein, Richard Attenborough, and Charlie Chaplin. The committee opened with 5 days of testimony from anti-communist industry professionals who all testified that Hollywood was rife with communist activity. Walt Disney was among those who testified, and he said of the supposed communist subversives, quote, "They ought to be smoked out." Disney later took out a full-page ad in Variety blaming an animation strike on communist agitators. Dang, Walt. Hate to hear his thoughts on whistling while you work.
Just add it to the list of why Disney sucked.
However, not everyone supported this witch hunt. 19 witnesses refused to cooperate and were deemed unfriendly. Some liberal actors, including Humphrey Bogart, Danny Kaye, and Lauren Bacall, showed up to support the unfriendly witnesses. They hoped their appearance would sway public opinion against HUAC. However, Bogey was later pressured into publicly denouncing communism in order to preserve his career. The hearings quickly descended into shameful shouting matches, as witnesses like John Howard Lawson and Dalton Trumbo repeatedly tried to make their points about the First Amendment and due process, but were shouted down and even escorted from the room. The already dubious hearings grew rancorous and chaotic and were adjourned after 9 days.
So basically, people like Humphrey Bogart were such huge stars that the industry knew they couldn't afford to just blacklist him. So for people like Humphrey Bogart, who they knew had ties to left-leaning politics, they basically did everything they could before they would essentially officially blacklist them and say, they threw everything at them, right? Your movie is not going to come out, or you're going to be dropped by the studio, et cetera, et cetera. And they would pressure them to either denounce communism, or in the case of Elia Kazan, which we'll get into, to give up the names of people in their orbits who were known communists. So this is what would happen. They would go after a big gun in the industry and either get them to publicly denounce communism in order to save their career, or get them to also rat out other communists in the industry. Yeah, when cancel culture was actually real.
Only 10 of the 19 wound up being questioned. The group became known as the Hollywood 10, and they were charged with criminal contempt. Less than a month later, studio heads met at the Waldorf Astoria and issued a statement saying that they were blacklisting the Hollywood 10 until they were cleared of charges and publicly declared that they weren't communists. The 10 assumed that the Supreme Court would dismiss the contempt charges on the grounds that the entire thing had been pretty flagrantly unconstitutional, but they were stunned when the court declined to even hear their appeal. 8 received 1-year sentences, while the other 2 received 6 months. After the country had seen the futility of the Hollywood 10's righteous indignation, HUAC found their witnesses' lips to be a little looser. People began naming names. Buses were met with no shortage of people being thrown beneath them. Acclaimed director Elia Kazan also admitted to being a former communist and dropped a streetcar-sized dime on 8 of his fellow group theater alumni, some of whom effectively never worked again as a result. John Garfield was blacklisted despite never being a communist. He just refused to testify, so he got blacklisted, and tragically passed away shortly thereafter. Lee Grant, an actress and director who spoke at J. Edward Bromberg's funeral and accused HUAC of literally hounding the actor to his grave, found herself blacklisted for 12 years as a result. Bromberg's had been one of the names Elia Kazan had given to the committee. Meanwhile, Western star Gary Cooper was unequivocally conservative and had even appeared as a friendly witness for the committee, although he refused to name any names. His later role in High Noon, for which he won an Oscar, is viewed by many as an indictment of HUAC and the Red Scare. 1954's Salt of the Earth was made exclusively by blacklisted filmmakers. A fictionalized retelling of the 1951 Empire Zinc strike in New Mexico, the film was the first Hollywood movie to portray unions in a positive light and to depict a strike from the perspective of the workers. Movies made before then, even those made by leftist filmmakers, typically showed unions as greedy, lazy, or otherwise nefarious entities standing in the way of good, honest work. Not only that, Salt of the Earth was also one of the first movies to depict women, in this case specifically women of color, effectively standing up for themselves and taking over the work of men. In other words, it was a dangerous film loaded with communist subversion and anti-American messages, according to the architects of the Blacklist, that is. Studios pressured exhibitors into not showing the movie. As a result, the filmmakers lost so much money that it killed their plan of developing movies outside the studio system using blacklisted creators. Some filmmakers produced movies to either justify their participation in the Blacklist or to fuel the anti-communist fears the Blacklist played upon. The most notable example is Elia Kazan's 1954 film, On the Waterfront, about a dock worker who must decide whether to spill the beans about a murder he witnessed or keep silent in order to protect the dock workers' union and save his career. An undeniable masterpiece that won 8 Oscars, the film is also a glorification of the noble art of snitching, and it depicts labor unions as sinister arms of organized crime. Anti-communist movies produced during this period tended to depict communists as shadowy boogeymen based on vague or simplistic critiques that weren't even necessarily true. But despite the oppressive threat of the Blacklist, movies addressing the injustice of HUAC and the Red Scare did still get made. They just had to be pretty sneaky about it. And here's where the legendarily prickly Dalton Trumbo re-enters the story. After the Supreme Court had failed to come to the aid of the Hollywood 10, Trumbo realized that the only way to win the fight against HUAC and the Blacklist was by swaying public opinion. And the way to do that was to make the Blacklist's architects look as foolish as possible. And Trumbo was pretty good at making people look foolish. In 1956, Robert Rich was awarded an Oscar for scripting The Brave One, but people widely suspected that it had actually been written by Trumbo, which was true. It was the beginning of his campaign to end the Blacklist, and he'd done it by using a front.
When we were asked, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? The committee was really preparing to ask you, are you now or have you ever been in favor of peace?
A front was a person who agreed to put their name on a project that had actually been produced by a blacklisted
Trumbo was
filmmaker.
based.
And fronts were instrumental in bringing an end to the Blacklist. The screenplay for The Bridge on the River Kwai, based on the novel by French writer Pierre Bol, was written by 2 blacklisted writers, but was credited to Bol, who didn't speak a word of English. When the screenplay credited to Bol won an Oscar, it brought another round of embarrassment to HUAC.
No more yazza.
The Defiant Ones also won an Oscar for its screenplay, which had been co-written by a blacklisted writer named Nedrick Young. Young has a brief cameo in the film, appearing on screen right as the writing credits are displayed. Finally, in 1960, Dalton Trumbo's name was credited on both Otto Preminger's Exodus and Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus. The fear that studios and producers had felt over featuring blacklisted artists was proven to be unwarranted, as Trumbo's undisguised involvement didn't wind up eliciting much of a response from the public. There were no widespread pickets or boycotts, and no full-throated outrage. And when the public didn't get stirred up over Trumbo's name appearing on Spartacus, a movie about a slave rebellion that ends with hundreds of rebels condemning themselves to execution rather than giving up one of their own to the Romans, it was an unmistakable sign that HUAC had lost its hold on popular opinion. But while many blacklisted artists bounced back, like Lee Grant and Dalton Trumbo, there were others who never recovered, like Marcia Hunt, John Garfield, and J. Edward Bromberg. Furthermore, a great deal of animosity still lingered between those who had given up names to HUAC and those who had suffered under the blacklist, or who had friends who had suffered. When an 89-year-old Elia Kazan was presented with a special Lifetime Achievement Oscar at the 71st Academy Awards in 1999, it was meant in part as a gesture of forgiveness, but a crowd of approximately 250 demonstrators gathered outside the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion to protest the award. And several of Kazan's peers in the audience, including Ed Harris and Nick Nolte, refused to stand or applaud during Kazan's acceptance speech, denying the director his final triumphant hero shot. For those who lost years of their livelihoods or even their entire careers, On the Waterfront's most famous line takes on a darkly ironic note.
I could have been a contender.
I could have been a contender. Here, I'll link the video. Uno momento. Here you go. Okay, so here's the moment that Elia Kazan wins a Lifetime Achievement Award. That was Spielberg and his wife. Ed Harris and Amy Madigan, his wife, were famously angry at Elia Kazan receiving this honorary Oscar after what he did in the 50s. And so it's interesting because this is a shot that went viral on Twitter recently. This is what I saw, and it reminded me of this controversy, which is why I wanted to pull this up and watch it on stream. Yes, Ed Harris, big union guy. Absolutely. And it's just funny because and then Nick Nolte as well famously protested this by not standing clapping. So this would be the equivalent of like, this would be like a Steven Spielberg at the end of his life, because Elia Kazan died about 4 years later. Steven Spielberg gets to the end of his life, okay, one of the most renowned directors in the industry, and they're presenting him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. But I don't know, decades earlier, Steven Spielberg had ratted out his people in the industry to save his own skin, throwing them under the bus in the process and effectively destroying the careers of people who had considered him a friend and a fellow comrade. And then Elia Kazan goes on to have to continue to have a great career, and then, Steven Spielberg continues to go on to have a great career and then be honored by the Academy. But during the performance, like having big A-list actors not standing to support him receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award. This was basically actors in Hollywood going, I don't care that this happened 45 years ago. We don't support him getting a Lifetime Achievement Award because of the careers that he destroyed, because of the people's lives that he destroyed by being a fucking rat. The analogy would be if Spielberg outed gays to save himself. But see, like, lots of people are sitting. Nick Nolte based. I mean, look at how many people are sitting. And then even ones who are standing and applauding to be polite, not looking thrilled, right? This is no Angela Bassett did the thing.
I thank you very much. I really like to hear that. And I want to thank the Academy for its courage, generosity, and I want to tell you that I've been a member of the Academy on and off for I don't know how many years. So I'm pleased to say what's best about them. They're damn good to work with. I also want to thank Marty. Where are you? Hiding behind me? Come on here. Right behind me. Where's Marty?
Martin Scorsese was famously someone who stood by his side and would not stand for people in the industry talking shit on Elia Kazan for being a rat.
Thank you.
And Bob. And Bob, too.
And Bobby. Bobby De Niro. Okay. Okay, thank you all very much. I think I can just slip away.
Well, 4 years later, he died. This is an example, I think, of what some people consider separating the art from the artist. So, Elia Kazan was, like I said, one of the most renowned and respected directors of all time. He was one of the greats. And so there are people who, when we talk about separating the art from the artist, you know, bad things that the artist did in their personal life, being able to separate that out from the art that they put forth into the world and, you know, the importance of that. But there are a lot of people who look at Elia Kazan specifically and say, no, this is not an instance of separating the art from the artist because of the impact that he had on so many people's careers, and also the fact that there were people who refused to rat, who refused to give in and throw their colleagues under the bus.
The billion people are going to know that there are people in Los Angeles who will not be silent when a confessed snitch, stool pigeon, gets an award. You can't separate his art from his life, and you can't separate his life from the lives he ruined.
Kazan is nothing more than a lowly stool pigeon of the McCarthy area. He'd rather have his own personal attributes and his fancy cars, and the hell with his fellow workers. He is a disgrace to the humankind.
Based.
It'll be really interesting to see what's on his mind, because I'm sure there's a lot of things flooding through it right now. You know, he certainly had to pay an awful price because a business he clearly loves so much, he must feel very outside it, and I can empathize with that feeling.
The thing is, though, is that Elia Kazan never ever said that he regretted what he did. In fact, he doubled and tripled down to the point that he made a fucking movie on the waterfront which glamorized and cast the role of the snitch in the hero's light. He never ever apologized for what he did, and he still maintained that he did the right thing because, like I said, he was a communist, and then he became an anti-communist, and he believed that anybody who was still a communist or a communist sympathizer or had left-leaning politics needed to go. And harboring the secret identities of those people was a bad thing, and so it was essentially his duty to report them. Waterworld can't separate Kevin Costner. That is true. We can't separate Kevin Costner from Waterworld. It's one thing to cave to immense power and coercion and then regret it in a tone, another to just say fuck them all. It also, depending on who you ask, there are many who believe that Elia Kazan's career would not have ended. He would have taken a hit, but it would not have completely ended because he was too powerful. He was too big. He was, like I said, I mean, he was considered at that time one of the top dogs on Broadway and in Hollywood. So there are a lot of people who think that like he would have survived, his career would have survived, and his MO for ratting out his friends was that he got to a point where he firmly believed it was his duty. And it's interesting though, because he had two hearings, and in the first hearing it was private. And he went into it saying that he was going to admit to communism himself, but he would not be naming any names. And then as he was leaving the hearing, they informed him that he would be having a second hearing and it would be public. And supposedly that was when he received pressure from Fox and from other studio heads. And basically he made the decision to rat out the people he ratted out. He also claims that the one thing that was holding him back was one of his good buddies who was a part of the group theater, which was this collective of theater people in New York that also had a communist sympathizing roots. One of his best homies from that theater group was somebody who he didn't want to rat out, supposedly. So he had dinner with him the night before his hearing, and supposedly Elia Kazan said, "Hey, what are you gonna do about ratting people out? Because I'll do the same." And his buddy was like, "I'm in the same boat as you are. I'm gonna talk." And so that was supposedly it for Elia Kazan, and was what the deciding factor was for him to rat the other people out, because he and his buddy were essentially like, let's do this together. How does one go from communist to anti-communist rat? Money went to his head. Yeah, I mean, we also see this happen in modern days or in modern times, where you have somebody like, maybe this isn't a perfect example, but Jimmy Dore, people who were on the left and now are shilling for the right. I'm not saying that that's the exact equivalent to what Elia Kazan did. He maintained he still believed in communism, but was against the American Communist Party. Yeah.
Having to go up there in front of a lot of people. I mean, the expectations that people are putting on this, it seems monumental right now.
I didn't know people made movies like his, and movies about people like me. And it was an extraordinary and life-changing experience. But I am violently opposed to everything that was done by the Un-American Activities Committee, and I feel sad about his testimony.
I think it's good that there is a hoopla, because it shows we live in a democracy. There's freedom of speech, and we are honoring an extraordinary artist. Period. That's what this evening's about.
I like how many people are giving non-answers. Like when you ask Twitch streamers about stuff and they're like, how do I respond to this in a way that doesn't really answer the question? But there's one person
You have a fascinating section in your book
who had some real thoughts on Elia Kazan. He does not hold back. And that would be Orson Welles, who you might know as the writer and director of what is considered the greatest film of all time, Citizen Kane.
Elia Kazan said that
here he is being asked, he was interviewed in front of Parisian film students on February 24th, 1982. Here's what he has to say about snitches.
It was not easy in America to raise funds to make film.
Don't worry about this part right here.
In that case, it was not easy to find money to make such a film.
Chère mademoiselle, you have chosen the wrong metteur en scène.
Vous avez pris le mauvais metteur en scène.
Because Elia Kazan is a traitor.
Et parce qu'Elia Kazan est un traître.
He is a man who sold to McCarthy all of his companions.
Qui a vendu tous ses compagnons à McCarthy.
At a time when he could continue to work in New York.
À une époque où il pouvait
at high salary.
À une époque où il pouvait continuer à travailler à New York à un très haut salaire.
And having sold all of his people to McCarthy, he then made a film called On the Waterfront, which was a celebration of the informer.
Et après avoir vendu tous ses amis à McCarthy, il a fait un film qui s'appelle Sur les quais et qui est une glorification du mouchard.
And therefore, no question which uses him as an example can be answered by me.
Et par conséquent, toute question qui se serve de son nom comme exemple ne pourra trouver de réponse auprès de moi.
I mean, that's a fucking call out.
I have to add that he is a very good director.
Je dois ajouter que c'est un excellent metteur en scène.
He's like, listen. Yeah, he's fucking great. Okay, he's one of the best.
Elia Kazan.
He's a goddamn rat.
And you learn the two greatest things in life. Never rat on your friends, and always keep your mouth shut.
Anytime you're feeling low.
It's interesting, too, because Zoe Kazan, she's been asked periodically about her grandfather. And it's something where she doesn't like to talk about it, obviously, and acknowledges that it was essentially like it was a stain on the family name and the family history, but she doesn't want to just completely throw her grandfather under the bus. But it's interesting. She's not asked about it often. She gets asked about it sometimes.
Though he may not be the first name that comes to mind when discussing the most influential figures in the cinematic world, Elia Kazan
sounds exactly like what lefties are doing nowadays. Dude, what are you talking about? Seriously, please tell me. Are you talking about this cancel culture, really, which does not exist? Please tell me what you are referring to that is the equivalent of McCarthyism and the Red Scare and the Hollywood Blacklist in the 1950s. Literally, please. Examples. Please. Hyperclap, the lefties are trying to censor us, brother. I mean... Even if you dislike cancel culture... Right, because here's the thing. Here's the thing. If that chatter wants to say that this is the equivalent to cancel culture nowadays, I beg you to point to examples of people in the industry who have been canceled for their political views and not because of heinous things that they have said, right? Simply just going, I'm a conservative. Oh, you lost your career. Like, I'm listening. Find me an example. Oh, you like, people will always go, Roseanne Barr. Roseanne Barr was not canceled because she's a conservative. She was canceled, which she still fucking wasn't. She has a career because she is a heinous, racist bitch. Like, these are people who are saying awful things, and it's not just because they identify as conservatives. And so what does that go to show you? That conservatives in Hollywood equals awful people who say awful things. Yo, they ain't coming back. I guess not. I don't know. But I think that distinction, though, needs to be made, right? Like, every time a conservative gets canceled in Hollywood, people think it's because they've been hunted down by the woke left and anybody who's a conservative is not allowed. It's like, no, there are conservatives in Hollywood. Chris Pratt, okay? They just do a better job of keeping their mouths shut and not saying racist or sexist or transphobic or, xenophobic or whatever phobic shit. That's the main difference. There's open conservatives as well who are still working. Clint Eastwood,
Kazan, whether you have heard his name before or not, could arguably be said to have had more of an impact on American cinema of the last half-century than any other individual. Not only due to the influence of his own filmography, which includes some of the most acclaimed and groundbreaking films of all time, but as co-founder of the Actors Studio, one of the nation's most prolific drama workshops, he had a hand in the popularization of what is known as method acting, a psychological...
Oh yeah, so Elia Kazan is partly responsible for Austin Butler being unable to lose the Elvis accent. It all comes full circle. Yeah, he had a hand in the creation of method acting, which is what led to poor Austin Butler forever being stuck talking like the king of rock.
Approach to acting that was later brought to mainstream prominence by actors such as Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Dustin Hoffman throughout the 1970s, all of whom were students of Lee Strasberg, referred to as the father of American method acting, who took over as artistic director of the studio in 1951. Said approach would go on to change the face of American cinema over the next several decades, and inspire some of the most acclaimed performers of our generation. Kazan's contributions to the medium have been praised by other acclaimed directors, with Nicholas Ray calling him the best actors director the United States has ever produced, and Stanley Kubrick stating Kazan was without question the best American director. But perhaps Elia's most notable and vocal admirer is director Martin Scorsese, who in 2010 made the documentary film A Letter to Elia, where he speaks of Kazan's influence on his own career and cinema as a whole. And thus, you can imagine it must have been quite the honor for Scorsese when he, along with Robert De Niro, was given the chance to present Kazan with an honorary Lifetime Achievement Oscar at the 71st Academy Awards in 1999. But as you will see, not everyone was as enthusiastic about Kazan being honored.
Did I ever tell you guys? Did I ever tell you the story of when I played softball with Ed Harris? It was incredible. So for a couple years, I used to play on this softball team, and it was all dudes. And the reason I heard about this softball team was when I was working at the club one night. I overheard one of the promoters talking to a guy and saying, "Hey, are you gonna play softball this weekend?" And the guy was like, "I don't know if I can." And me being nosy was like, "Oh, you play on a softball team? I'm looking to join a league." And he's like, "Well, it's not really a league. We just get together every Saturday and split up into two teams." I was like, "That's cool. Like I'm athletic. I'm looking to get back into sports." And he's like, "Well, women don't play." I go, "Okay, well, do women not play because they're not allowed to play, or because they don't ask?" And he's like, "Well, no, they're allowed to play. It's just, well, I don't know. I mean, okay, well, there's like famous people who show up to this thing, so you can't be weird." And I was like, "Dude, I work at a club. I see so many famous people at this point. I don't give a shit. I'm not going to show up for softball and be a fucking freak if there's an actor there. It's fine." So anyway, he ends up sending me the deets for the next game. I don't think he expected me to show up, because when I showed up, everyone was shocked. And I was also surprised how many random actors were playing. So I would say about 6 months into weekly softball matches, one day I show up and I see Ed Harris. And I was like, "Oh my God, that's motherfucking Ed Harris." And he still, I swear to God, he still had like hospital bandages around his wrists because he had, I guess, just been in the hospital, and he's pretty old. And yet he still showed up to play in this softball game. And I ended up being on his team, and I admired him so much because he was a mean son of a bitch. He was fucking yelling at us. He was fucking pissed, man. I was like, damn it, I'm letting Ed Harris down. It genuinely was one of the It was one of the wildest experiences ever playing softball with Ed Harris, who had just gotten out of the... No, he played. Nope, he played. I'm pretty sure he played like... I want to say he played like first base. He was in the infield. I was so determined not to let him down that there was one play where the ball was hit to right field, and this was a field where there were lots of trees and stuff everywhere. So if you didn't watch where you're going, in the face, ball is hit to right field. It would be a big play if I could make it. I was determined not to let Ed Harris down. So I'm running back. I have my glove outstretched. I'm imagining like the triumphant cheers and the feeling of when I catch this ball and I not only exceed these dudes' expectations and like women can play softball too, but I get to impress Ed Harris. And as I'm going back, I don't see the gigantic tree branch that just bitch slaps me across the face and takes me out, and people ran over in concern that I was dead. Yeah. I wish I had been dead. I wish I had been killed. Because I disappointed Ed Harris. I let him down, man. I let him fucking down, man. Did Ed Harris care if you died? I don't think so. I don't think so. CO Beeble, thank you for hanging out. Yeah, I wish I had died. Yeah. Anyway, Ed Harris, based as fuck.
Make such a film.
Chère mademoiselle, you have chosen the wrong, because Elia Kazan is a traitor.
For them to be again insulted by a man who had just destroyed their lives, their livelihood, so on and so forth. And for the Academy now to give him an honorary Oscar, I thought was totally despicable.
This guy is a serial betrayer.
Yeah. He is a disgrace to the human
This
kind.
dude.
The billion people are going to know that there are people in Los Angeles who will not be silent. You can't separate his art from his life, and you can't separate his life from the lives he ruined.
I am sure those of you who have never heard the name Elia Kazan are quite confused as to what this is all about. So for the sake of clarity, I'd say it's best if we start at the beginning. The son of Greek immigrants, Elia moved to America at the age of 8. Upon reaching adulthood, Elia set out to pursue a career in acting and would later find what he would call the greatest thing that would ever happen to him in his professional life, the group theater. Formed in New York City 1931 by Cheryl Crawford, Harold Clurman, and Lee Strasberg, which would be the precursor and inspiration for the Actors Studio. The group consisted of writers, directors, actors, all of whom came together in a collaborative effort to hone their artistic aspirations, producing works that dealt with timely and controversial social and political issues. It was here that co-founder Lee Strasberg would develop what is known as the method, the framework that would fundamentally change the landscape of American acting over the next near century. Despite being told by both Strasberg and Clurman that his acting chops were nothing special, Kazan became one of the most notable actors of the theater. But it was his turn as a director that would cement him as the towering figure he is considered today. Kazan directed a number of highly acclaimed stage productions while still with the group theater, and after its disbandment in 1941. He made his feature film debut in 1945 with an adaptation of Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, aka that book we all read in grade school at one point or another. another, and would go on to win Best Director at the 20th Academy Awards for 1947's Gentleman's Agreement. That same year, Kazan would form the Actor Studio with Cheryl Crawford, co-founder of the group theater, and director Robert Lewis. And in 1949, Kazan would direct the original Pulitzer Prize-winning Broadway production of Death of a Salesman, penned by legendary playwright.
So, real quick, I'm trying to remember the story. With Arthur Miller and Elia Kazan. Hold on. Oh, and also, if you don't know Arthur Miller, I mean, he's an amazing playwright, but you also might know him as one of the husbands of Marilyn Monroe. Okay, so is this a story? Shit, I don't know if I can find it. It had to do with oh God, was it Watch Me If You Can? So for a long time, Arthur Miller and Elia Kazan were very, very close collaborators. Elia Kazan is very famous for directing Death of a Salesman. And there's some story that goes that after Elia Kazan had ratted on people in the industry, it was something where like he received one of Arthur Miller's new plays, and he wrote back to him that he would be honored to direct it. Supposedly Arthur Miller wrote him back and said, I don't know, it was something like, "Oh, I just wanted you to read that because you'll never direct one of my plays ever again." I don't know. I don't exactly remember how the story goes, but these two were very, very legendary, iconic collaborators because Arthur Miller was and is largely seen as one of the greatest playwrights of all time.
Right, Arthur Miller, a close friend and collaborator of Kazan's. By the late 1940s, it was safe to say Kazan had established himself as an essential figure in both the theater and film industries. But it was only a few years later when he would change the course of cinema forever.
You must be Stanley. I'm Blanche.
Why, I do declare.
Yes.
Oh, hi. Yeah, where's the little woman?
In 1951, A Streetcar Named Desire was released by Warner Brothers Studios, directed by Kazan and starring Vivien Leigh, Marlon Brando, Kim Hunter, and Carl Malden. Based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning play by the great Tennessee Williams, the film was widely acclaimed, going on to win a record 3 acting nominations for Leigh, Hunter, and Malden. Ironically, the film would have swept the acting categories, but Brando was not awarded Best Actor, despite the film being his breakout performance. Kazan had produced a stage version of the play in 1947, starring both Brando and Malden, but it was the film adaptation that served as a sledgehammer to the current state of American cinema. The film was noted for its commitment to realism and fearless exploration of taboo and controversial topics, introducing a psychological and sexual intensity to the screen that perhaps had never been seen before. The film could also be said to be a watershed moment in terms of the shift from the more traditional theatrical style of acting present in the early days of cinema and the method-based approach that would be embraced in the decades to come, a dichotomy blatantly demonstrated in the first scene between Brando and Leigh. It was at this moment, the introduction of Stanley Kowalski, that broke the floodgates of what was thought possible.
Do you know who young Marlon Brando kind of reminds me of? Is Jacob Elordi. Y'all know who Jacob Elordi is from Euphoria? He's got a little, yeah, I can see it.
made every straight dude question their sexuality. Kazan would go on to direct other acclaimed films, notably On the Waterfront and East of Eden, each catapulting their leading men, Marlon Brando and James Dean respectively, into legendary status overnight, cementing his impact on the world of cinema.
Okay, if y'all had to pick one in terms of sex appeal, who floats your boat more? James Dean or Marlon Brando? Got a lot of love for James Dean.
Kazan's profile as a director only grew after the release of Streetcar in 1951, but it was what occurred in 1952 that would be forever considered Kazan's most career-defining
100% straight. Let Marlon Brando fuck the shit out of me.
event. But in order to give context, we need to back up a bit.
Mr. Bieberman, are you a member of the Screenwriters Guild, or have you ever been a member of the Screenwriters Guild?
Now, Mr. Stribling, I would like to reply to this very quietly. Mr. Chairman also. If I will not be interrupted, I will attempt to give you a full answer to this question.
Brando's a far better actor. Yeah, we don't give a shit about that. Who butters your muffin?
The real purpose of this investigation...
That is not... Are you a member of the Communist Party, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Are you a member of the Communist Party? Are you now, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
In 1938, the United States House of Representatives formed HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, to conduct investigations on those with alleged sympathies to fascist and/or communist ideologies. Following World War II, fearing that the advent of mass media entertainment could be used to spread anti-American sentiment, HUAC set its crosshairs on Hollywood, which led to the creation of what is commonly referred to as the Blacklist. In short, if an industry member had ties to any pro-communist organizations, had merely expressed pro-communist sentiments, or even if they were merely whispers that they did, regardless of the veracity of said claims, that individual could find themselves completely barred from working in the industry in any way.
I'm still waiting for that one chatter to provide the evidence of how this is what the left is doing to conservatives in Hollywood today. I'm still waiting. I'm gonna go get a little snack. I'll be right back. Let me know if they
effectively destroying their career in the blink of an eye. Even if there was no suspicion of an individual having any communist ties, simply refusing to appear before HUAC at all would more than likely result in that individual finding themselves blacklisted. In 1952, Kazan was called upon HUAC in regard to his affiliation with the U.S. Communist Party, which he was a member of for only 18 months in the mid-1930s, over a decade prior to a subpoena. Though he originally refused to name names in his first testimony to HUAC, which was held in private, author Martin Gottfried revealed in an interview in 2004 that someone from the committee, despite the committee itself having no plans to hold Kazan in contempt of court, leaked Kazan's private testimony to the press.
But ironically enough, it was an informer from the committee.
LMAO, did I seriously miss someone? Yes. And I wasn't even being mean. I was like, please provide me some examples.
Who told some newspaper in Los Angeles that Kazan had not named anyone and had refused to. And that was when Spyro Skouras, the head of 20th Century Fox, said, you better name names or else you're never going to work in Hollywood again.
His career at risk? Ultimately, Kazan gave to the committee the names of 8 fellow members of the Communist Party, all former colleagues of his at the group theater. Actors and spouses Phoebe Brand and Morris Karnofsky, actor Tony Kraber, actor Ted Wellman, actor Louis Leverett, who had starred in Kazan's Gentleman's Agreement, playwright Clifford Ordetz, who had made a deal with Kazan that they would name each other in their testimonies, and gave to the committee the names of the same individuals Kazan did, but unlike Kazan, suffered irreparable damage to his career. Actress Paula Strasberg, the wife of Lee Strasberg, whom Kazan had stated was like a father to him during his group theater days, and actor J. Edward Bromberg, who had been blacklisted the year before Kazan's testimony after refusing to cooperate with the committee, resulting in him suffering from a tremendous amount of turmoil, which may have contributed to his fatal heart attack in December of 1951. Following his testimony, Kazan took out a full-page ad in the New York Times to deliver a statement in regard to the rationalization behind his decision, namely his extreme distaste for communist ideology, and throughout his life, he was consistent in regard to its morality.
Do you regret the decision now that you did that?
No, I don't. I'm the opposite. Since everything that's been revealed since then, I feel that anyone who's gone through Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the Nazi-Soviet pact, and all the rest of it, who still goes on that way, shouldn't have sympathy. I think they should be brought up as I was to confront their past and say what they really think.
Whether Kazan thought he was truly making a moral decision, or whether he just wanted to save his own career, it should be noted that Kazan stated the names he gave had already been given to the committee by others, although this has been disputed.
Yeah,
Whatever the
fucking
case,
lie.
it was inconsequential to his industry colleagues, many of whom immediately cut ties with Kazan, branding him a traitor. However, the most devastating blow, what truly earned Kazan the scorn and disdain of his former friends and peers, would occur 2 years later upon the release of what is arguably Kazan's magnum opus.
They thought they was going to beat an education out of me, but I foxed them.
Maybe they just didn't know how to handle you.
How would you have done it?
With a little more patience and kindness. That's what makes people mean and difficult. People don't care enough about them.
Upon its release in 1954, On the Waterfront was deemed an instant classic and went on to win 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Brando's first win for Best Actor, his performance being hailed as one of the most legendary and influential in American cinematic history, and Kazan's second win for Best Director. For those of you who may have seen the film without knowing of Kazan's HUAC testimony, I'm sure you may be cringing, as this illumination now puts the context under which On the Waterfront was made in a
Anyone seen this movie?
far more insidious light. For those of you who are not familiar, the film tells the story of dock worker Terry Malloy, who after witnessing the retaliation murder of a fellow dock worker who was going to testify against corrupt union boss Johnny Friendly,
Yeah, I mean this
eventually
is a classic. So if you ever were in film class, I would assume you saw at least some of this.
decides to testify against Friendly, ceasing his mob-controlled influence over the dock workers union. Though Terry is initially shunned by his peers, the infamous final scene features him confronting Friendly, passionately declaring he is proud of his testimony, which in turn leads to the other workers supporting Terry. So, yeah,
I could have been a
It wasn't
contender.
exactly subtle that the film seemed to be a direct response to those who criticized Kazan after his HUAC testimony. In the film, Terry's testimony is framed as a heroic and courageous act, and it is those who shunned him that ultimately must learn the error of their ways. Despite the film's wide acclaim, it only intensified the bitterness of those who had disavowed Kazan. Arthur Miller, who had cut ties with Kazan following the HUAC testimony, had actually written the early drafts of the script that would go on to become On the Waterfront before their falling out, and was appalled upon seeing how Kazan morphed his story into what seemed like an attack on those who turned their backs on him, Miller included. So much so that Miller wrote the stage play A View from the Bridge as a retort to On the Waterfront, in which the informer of the story is framed as a villain. He even sent Kazan a copy of the script as a bit of an extra go fuck yourself.
This
2 years later, Miller was
that's the story that I was trying to find, that I had remembered reading once upon a time, that he sent that to Elia Kazan, who was like, "Oh, I would be honored, to direct this. I would love to." And he was basically like, "You'll never direct anything of mine ever again, dude."
called to testify in front of HUAC himself, but refused to name a single name, and as a result was found guilty of contempt, though the charge was later overturned, and was blacklisted. Following the release of On the Waterfront, Kazan continued to build his filmography, including directing 1955's East of Eden, the screen debut of the late James Dean, and 1961's Splendor in the Grass. However, his testimony continued to be a shadow he could not escape from even after the unofficial lifting of the blacklist in 1960. During the production of Splendor, it is said that actor Warren Beatty, upon becoming frustrated with Kazan and wanting to antagonize him, asked him why he named all those names, to which Kazan responded by pulling Beatty into a room and berating him for several hours. And then there was the incident in 1982 where Orson Welles lambasted Kazan during an interview in Paris.
He is a man who sold to McCarthy all of his companions. He then made a film called On the Waterfront, which was a celebration of the informer. No question which uses him as an example can be answered by me.
Though Kazan stated he felt no remorse over his decision, he has acknowledged the dark times that followed as a result of losing the friendship and admiration of many of his colleagues. Though Kazan did make some of the most notable films of his career post-testimony, note that despite him making 14 films in the 15 years between his debut in 1945 to the lifting of the Blacklist in 1960, he would go on to make only 5 films in the next 15 years. His final film, The Last Tycoon, starring Robert De Niro and Jack Nicholson, being released in 1976. Whether or not this was as a result of his contentious reputation in the industry cannot be said. Despite it taking place nearly 5 decades after his testimony and over 20 years after his retirement, the announcement that Kazan would be receiving an honorary Oscar at the 1999 Academy Awards sparked controversy and protest, and his acceptance of the award marked his final major public appearance before his passing in 2003. So, what are we left with?
And then during the McCarthy era, in 1952, you were called to testify before the House Committee of Un-American Activities. And you actually testified against a lot of people that you'd worked with, and named a lot of names. What did you hope to gain by that?
Gain nothing, and just the truth. The only thing I had to gain was the feeling that I was doing the right thing. I didn't have a damn thing to gain about it. It meant a lot to me to say that...
But a lot of people didn't do that, did they? They would have protected people that they'd known.
Well, they can do it. They do what they thought was right. I did what I thought was right.
Why did you choose that time when you were in fact called to testify to speak out? I mean, if you felt as you did, why didn't you say something before?
A while back, I posted a poll asking my community for their opinions in regard to the death of the author. The origin of the concept was established in a 1967 essay by French literary critic Roland Barthes, who criticized the practice of incorporating the views and/or background of the author of a particular work when interpreting said work. The idea is that whatever an artist meant to imply with a particular piece is completely irrelevant, and their interpretation of their own work is no more or less valid than anyone else's. However, over time, the term has sort of been co-opted and been used to refer to the discussion in relation to how we as the public reconcile with the fact that the art we love and admire may have been created by morally reprehensible individuals. Can we separate a piece of art from the artist? The consensus of the community was that most felt the same way that I do, which is that an artist's work can be separated from who they are as a person. Now, that is not to speak to one's emotional reaction to a particular piece of art due to the actions of the artist. This will vary from person to person. Personally, the knowledge of an artist being a subpar individual doesn't seem to affect my emotional reaction to their art, outside of cringing a little every time I see the Weinstein Company logo pop up before a film. But it seems that most would agree that, say, stating a film is immaculately directed is not an endorsement of the director's character. However, things get complicated when we discuss the other elements surrounding this topic, particularly when the artist is still alive and working to this day. Despite its horrid subject matter, I can say Birth of a Nation is a revolutionary technical achievement without worrying if I am raising the profile of director D.W. Griffith, as he has been dead for over 70 years. But what about a director who is still alive and working? Perhaps I can praise a film they make without praising them directly, but does buying a ticket or renting the film on a streaming service fall into a gray area, as I am to some extent supporting them monetarily? What about popular actors who work with a controversial director? Should we criticize them for doing so? But then again, films are made by many people. Is it reasonable to hold PAs accountable if they agree to work on the film? If we don't financially support the film, are we hurting the careers of all the other artists involved with its production? Does the severity of the director's transgressions play a role? What if they are simply accusations as opposed to proven facts? And then, of course, things become even more serpentine when it comes to the accolades.
Goes for Roman Polanski.
with a pianist.
Yeah, I mean,
In
you
two
know,
thou-
there's a famous clip that I think I showed here on stream of Roman Polanski winning an award at what is the equivalent of the in France, the French Oscars, and Celine Sciamma, who is the director of Portrait of a Lady on Fire, as well as Adele Haenel, who is the lead actress, standing up in protest and walking out as he's receiving this award. I mean, this was like 3 years ago, maybe.
2002, the Academy Awards award Best Director to Roman Polanski, who, in 1978, fled U.S. jurisdiction after being convicted of unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor, which is a somewhat less horrific-sounding way to say he drugged and raped a 13-year-old girl. Multiple other sexual assault allegations have come out in the years since he fled to Europe. So what are we to make of this particular case? Is the award meant to celebrate Polanski as a person, or simply his directing? Should the Academy have given him the award regardless of the film's merits? Was simply nominating him at all paramount to condoning his horrible acts? Should Adrien Brody not have won Best Actor, or even been nominated for his role in the film? Was him taking the role, if not an endorsement of, akin to overlooking Polanski's actions? Were those in the audience who applauded celebrating Polanski as a person, or simply showing respect for the artistry? Is there a way to do one without simultaneously doing the other? I don't think I know what the right and or wrong answer is. I don't know if there is a right and or wrong answer, and I don't know if right and wrong even factors into it at all. And that is mainly why I think conversations in regard to this topic end up becoming so tumultuous, as there are so many nuances and asterisks that kick the legs out from under any conclusion one may come to. This video essay is actually a revival of a project I originally...
Listen, this dude is asking, he's asking a lot of questions, and I get it, because we have this conversation all the time, right? Because here's the thing. Across art forms, music, literature, film, really, really anything, right? There are more of the greats in these various art forms. There are more of them who have really just got some stains on their personal lives for a variety of reasons. There are more of them than there are less, right? That's why when we're having a conversation about literature and about authors and books that we should still or should not read today, if we stopped reading classic books by authors who were problematic and who did bad things, we would there would just be too many to count. Now, personally speaking, Rosemary's Baby is one of my favorite films. I consider it one of the greatest horrors of all time. But I will no longer support Roman Polanski. So if Roman Polanski were to come out with a new film, or like, you know, the films that he has come out with since he was found guilty of drugging and raping this girl, I would not be consuming an award, or one of his films, nor do I think that he should receive an award. Consume the art, shit on the artist. However, if somebody were to watch, like if you were to continue to watch Woody Allen films, you know, I wouldn't sit here and say, fuck you. Because like I said, now I think that there are some people who are just, I don't know. I mean, it gets complicated. I mean, because Harvey Weinstein is such a fucking monster, but the amount of amazing films that came out of Miramax is too many to count. I grew up watching Cosby, but right, exactly. Like, I wouldn't watch a movie that came out now that had Bill Cosby in it. But I do believe that there are many instances of supporting the art from the artist while acknowledging that the artist was a real piece of shit and not allowing our love of the art that they created to overshadow our opinions on the artist. Having context is important. Yes, absolutely. Because unfortunately, there are a lot of shitty people who have made very, very important pieces of art. Like Roman Polanski with Rosemary's Baby. Rosemary's Baby was truly one of the first films, and it's why it's such an important film in general, and not just for horror lovers, that showed women being gaslit, right? Through oh my god, why am I blanking on her name? Somebody help me. My brain boop beep boop 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 boop. Mia Farrow. Yes, thank you. Mia Farrow's character was one that we really hadn't seen in film. And the themes that are presented in Rosemary's Baby were ones that had not really been tackled in film, and that's why it is such a it's such an important and significant movie. I know, poor Mia Farrow, Polanski, and Woody Allen. For me, I'm fine. And I also think this is a personal decision. Whether or not you personally will choose to consume art by somebody who is a monster, right? Or has done bad things. I think with this particular topic, it is a personal decision for people to make. But I think that we can criticize, like, for instance, Chris Brown, right? I have criticized people who continue to work with Chris Brown, like Chloe Bailey. And then also people in the music industry, especially women, who not only work with Chris Brown, but support Chris Brown and focus only on how great of an artist Chris Brown is, while not acknowledging the fact that he is a serial abuser and just a real big piece of shit. Still watch some Mel Gibson movies. Right, this is what I'm saying. Like, if you were to stop completely consuming any art that had been made by a person, by an artist who did bad things or was not a great person, then it would be a lot. It would be a fuck ton. Right? So I do believe that it's called ethical consumption in the sense that you consume the art while also being aware of the artist and not condoning the personal history of the artist just because they create great art. Directly working with the person when you know they're shitty and have the luxury of not doing so is pretty messed up to me. I agree with that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, actresses who still work with Woody Allen. Like, yeah, I think they rightfully should be called out and criticized. Conscious critical consumption. Yeah, that's what I meant more than ethical consumption.
Originally conceived back during my freshman year of college. After learning of Kazan's HUAC testimony, I was fascinated by the story, originally seeing Kazan as a tragic figure who was torn between loyalty to his friends and patriotic duty. But almost a decade later, upon doing more research, my initial impression of Kazan as a tortured character was squandered by discovering that, well, to be frank, Kazan was most likely just a raging egomaniac. His statement in the New York Times, reframing the main conflict of On the Waterfront, berating Warren Beatty on the set of Splendor in the Grass. Though I originally romanticized these acts as those of a man struggling with the guilt of betraying his former colleagues, in retrospect, the more plausible explanation is that he had not a shred of remorse for what he did, not because he believed he had made the morally correct decision, but because he just didn't care and was only concerned with protecting his own career. There were other bits of information I came across during my research, many found in the selected letters of Elia Kazan, a collection of letters Kazan wrote throughout his life and his autobiography that only bolstered this theory. A sexual assault allegation, extramarital affairs, an array of regressive and misogynistic comments, an air of rampant narcissism. Earlier, I featured a clip of an...
Yeah, that's just pretty par for the course in this era. Thoughts on Louis C.K.? Yeah, I mean, he's gross, and I don't think that he really faced repercussions for his actions. And like, do I think he's a Harvey Weinstein? No, but there's also a scale to being a piece of shit.
Interview from 1978 in which Kazan speaks of how he found comfort in the fact that, while he lost a number of friends following his testimony, he found solace in the friendships of those who supported and stood by him.
You did in fact lose a lot of friends through that, and you were blacklisted for a time. Did it make it more difficult for you to work in Hollywood after that?
It did, because I had a certain notoriety. It did make it more difficult for me to work, but I don't mind losing friends if it's in a good cause. And I also gained a lot of friends. A lot of people admired what I did.
Well, about that.
For the 30 years after he decided to retire from the film business, he wrote a memoir. And in that memoir, he told of how he had adulterous affairs with the wives of all the men who had supported him for 30 years.
Wow. However, despite who Kazan was as a person, regardless of what was truly in his heart that day in 1952, and whether or not he felt even a sliver of guilt about it, does any of that matter? When he was awarded his Lifetime Achievement Oscar, some stood and clapped, some remained seated and were silent. I wonder, what is it that each of these individuals was thinking in the moment? What was the rationalization behind their decision? I will stand and applaud the man for his artistry, despite his character. I refuse to honor a man who betrayed his friends, regardless of his prolific body of work. Were those who stood and applauded, in a sense, trivializing the lives and careers Kazan ruined all those years ago? Were those who refused to clap disrespecting Kazan's impact on the world of cinema? Among those who stood and applauded Kazan was none other than Warren Beatty. George Stevens Jr., founder of the American Film Institute.
Yeah, like, I think consuming art is different than giving accolades and awards to people who did really bad things, right? Like, if I were at an award show and Roman Polanski was receiving some type of honor, right? And people were standing up and clapping and applauding, I would be fucking livid. I would do the same thing that Celine Sciamma and Adele Haenel did, which was get up and leave and say, I will have no part of it. I will have no part of it. Because it is in this, I do think in that specific instance of being at an award show, right? And choosing to honor and award a fucking monster, that is not separating the art and the artist.
Institute speculated as to why Beatty, despite his contentious encounter with Kazan while making Splendor in the Grass, decided to applaud. I believe we were both standing for the same reason, out of regard for the creativity, the stamina, and the many fierce battles and lonely nights that had gone into the man's 20 motion pictures. Ironically, the Institute ended up voting against honoring Kazan with their own Lifetime Achievement Award. Though not all members were on board with this decision. Said one executive, "It doesn't matter whether Kazan ratted on his friends, just as it doesn't matter whether Orson Welles and John Huston treated their wives badly, or Alfred Hitchcock was a misogynist, or David Lean was not a terribly nice man. It doesn't matter finally. All that matters is the movies. You're honoring a person's body of work." Conversely, in 1997, after the Los Angeles Film Critics Association decided to not award Kazan their Career Achievement Award, the New York Times released an article accusing the association, ironically, of blacklisting Kazan. In response, VP of the association, Joseph McBride, sent a letter to the editor, which was, also ironically, exactly what Kazan did back in 1952, same publication and all, where he retorted, "Your contention that the political dimensions of an artist's life and work should be considered irrelevant to such honors is naive at best and dangerous at worst. It would compound and perpetuate the moral wrongs of the Blacklist era for film critics to honor a career built upon the ruination of other people's careers. Personally, I can't say I completely agree or disagree with either statement. This discussion, one that isn't restricted to American cinema."
Yeah, this is
Roman Polanski pour J'accuse.
A controversial win for the Franco-Polish filmmaker. Actresses stormed out of the theatre.
Yeah, this is what I'm talking
The face
about.
of France's Me Too movement, Adèle Haenel, mouthing the word shame as she exited.
One that isn't restricted to film, one that isn't even restricted to the arts, will continue to generate contention. Contention which has been seen to have the capability of causing division among friends and colleagues. Among those who remained seated during Kazan's acceptance of his honorary Oscar was actor Nick Nolte, who stated doing so cost him his working relationship with Martin Scorsese, who took offense to Nolte's refusal to honor his idol. In my video discussing male body transformations, I alluded to concepts such as parasocial relationships and celebrity worship, when I discussed how when we as an audience, due to our emotional attachment to and perception of an actor, celebrity, or athlete, regardless of whether or not we have even met them, are faced with information that conflicts with that perception, we may ignore it, if not react with hostility. In the case of Scorsese, was his frustration with Nolte driven solely by what he perceived as disrespect for the craft and Kazan's body of work? Or was it also, at least in part, due to the emotional significance of Kazan's films on his own career?
I also want to thank Marty. Where are you? Where are you? Hiding behind me? Come on here. Right behind you. Where's Marty? Right here. Thank you. Thank you.
And said frustration was caused by Kazan's sordid past being brought to the forefront. Ironically, as you may have noted from the opening of this video, Scorsese's own Goodfellas tells the true story of mob informant Henry Hill, who testifies against his associates in the film's finale. And, unlike in On the Waterfront, rather than being framed as an act of courage, it is framed as one of self-preservation. Looking back, I wonder if my own initial romanticized view of the circumstances surrounding Kazan's testimony was as a result of not only my desire to derive a compelling narrative out of the tale, but my admiration for Kazan's films, particularly Streetcar, which was a film that knocked me out of my noob phase when I was in my teens, and exposed me to films of the golden age of American cinema. But today, as perhaps a demonstration of Occam's razor, I must say it is far more likely that the most simple and disheartening explanation is the correct one, that Kazan made his choice to protect his own career, regardless of how many others it destroyed, and didn't feel a shred of remorse for doing so. Despite my view of who Kazan was having changed quite a bit since I originally conceived this project, I can't ultimately say whether or not the Academy honoring him was the right decision, nor can I make a judgment as to who among the audience that night made the right call. Is honoring his filmography paramount to reducing the severity of his actions and setting a precedent that an artist's character shouldn't matter? Does refusing to honor his work imply that one's art should not be separated from who they are, and the quality of their character should always be a factor in how we perceive said art? In that same 1978 interview I mentioned earlier, Kazan was asked why he decided to testify before the committee. Whether or not his rationalization for making the decision was genuine, I found one of Kazan's quotes from said interview to be applicable to my conundrum.
Why did you choose that time when you were in fact called to testify to speak out? I mean, if you felt as you did, why didn't you say something before? You were in fact kicked out of the Communist Party. I mean, were you in a way trying to get back at them?
Not at all, no, because not until I was actually in the position of making a choice, which is essentially a very difficult choice. Did I make it? You never know what you're going to do in those circumstances, Valerie, until you're confronted. You either must do this or that. There are choices in life, Valerie, that either way you go are painful. I didn't like to do it, but I thought, when I thought about it very carefully, I thought it was the better of two mean alternatives.
And with that in mind, I ask you, as I have asked myself, had you been there that night, what would you have done? Would you have stood and clapped? Would you have remained seated and silent? And if you think you know what you would have done, ask yourself, does it come with a cost?
Okay. Okay, thank you all very much. I think I can just slip away.
There absolutely has to be a line that can't be crossed. If you cross it, you should be outed. Here, I'm going to link this video, by the way. There are so few examples of gigantic figures in the industry whose crimes were brought to light and they never made art again. Harvey Weinstein, for instance, is probably the biggest example of them all, right? Let's say justice was not served and Harvey Weinstein did not go to prison for his various crimes, including raping or drugging and raping women. So, you know, there could have been this world where Harvey Weinstein came back to Hollywood and continued to make great movies. I mean, who knows, right? But we'll never have that world because he did go to prison. But Roman Polanski, even though he was convicted of drugging and raping a girl, has continued to make films and also win awards. So, you know, do we get to a point where if the crimes that someone has committed come to light and are so heinous that they genuinely should not have opportunities ever again, is, you know, would the best way to would the best way to handle situations like this be just never allowing them to make films again, right? Like you can watch their old stuff. So you can watch Rosemary's Baby, you can watch old Roman Polanski films, but he shouldn't be able to, I mean, listen, he can go make a movie if he wants to, but he shouldn't have like studios financing him, actors working with him, and then receiving awards for those films. It is hard sometimes to know where to draw the line, right? What counts? What is a line where you cross it and that's it? That's all.